Hello there, and welcome to the latest episode of Ingress Point. Today we're going to talk about everybody's favourite scoundrel, Hondo. And we're going to jump into the box that was just released. And what we're going to look at it from is multiple viewpoints. One being, are the characters and units within the box, any good, if we look at them kind of in a vacuum. And then if we start trying to maximise their synergies, who might we pair them with? And then I'll try and answer the question of, do you ever try and go full scoundrel? Okay, so if we're going to do that, the first thing we need to do is look at the big man himself, Hondo. Hondo, I will say before we start, he's quite an unusual character. Everything about him is a bit weird, so he's kind of a hard one to appraise, but we're going to do our best here. The first thing about him, and it's very important to note for everything else, is that he is a 2 force point 7 squad point character. Normally what we've seen is the lower force point you have, the more squad points you have, but not in this case, so he kind of turns that on its head, and the reason for that is probably his tactic, that's just good business, which says at the start of his activation, refresh your force for each active objective controlled by another player. So force refresh is definitely has potential to be very strong, but there's a few ways in which it's worse than perhaps just having a larger force points total to begin with, and there's kind of a few reasons for that. First, I think, is as characters get injured, their abilities cost more, and you can refresh force and have a lot of force available kind of over the course of a game, but if you have a low starting cap, if you like. So, for example, if you put Hondo and Cad Bane together, your total cap of force is 4. As you get injured, you just may not have enough force available to use your abilities, just because your total is so low, and you can't refresh that quickly. So I think it is kind of limiting. Another reason I think it's limiting is it's strong in the early game, perhaps weak in the late, and the reason for that is, in an early game, especially in Struggle 1, in something like Sabotage Showdown, it's quite likely your opponent will have 3 objective tokens under their control. But as you get later into the game, when there's only 3 objectives available, if you're doing very badly, and in a state where you're probably going to lose the game, you can get 3 force back when maybe it's too late. And if you are doing well, and your opponent has, say, a single objective, you're only refreshing 1 force, and it's kind of low power and maybe gives them a chance to pull themselves back into the game because you're not getting the amount of force that you need. And the last thing I don't particularly like about it is it really means Hondo does not want to be going first, and that's fine. You can kind of get away with having 1 character, possibly 2 if you want to be risky, that needs to go into reserve if you draw it from your order deck first. If you have more than that, you kind of risk screwing yourself over a bit, because you'll draw something that doesn't want to go first, but it has to, because something's already in reserve. So it's definitely, potentially strong, and you definitely need to time when Hondo activates well, but I think there is definitely a few downsides to it as well. So I think I may call that, I don't know, maybe I'm neutral a bit on it. I kind of just wish he had more force to begin with. Right, but let's move on. Inspiring stories, so many of them true. Choose an allied unit, 1 character in this unit, and each character in the chosen unit may dash. Very strong. It costs a single force point, but there's no range limit on it, there's no tag limit on it, it just has to be an ally. And you get to dash, up to 3 characters if there's 2 in the chosen unit. So that's just Shatterpoint fundamentals. Is very good. I think there's perhaps dyssynergy between that and that's just good business, because that's the kind of thing you might want to do very early in the game, and get stuff up the board. Meaning maybe you want Hondo to go early, but if he goes early, you're not refreshing that much force. So that's kind of what I mean about how order activation is relevant to the force refresh power. But inspiring stories, definitely very good. Very happy to have that on any kind of unit. Next one, what have we here? So again, cost of force, it's an active ability. Choose a unit within 2 and it gets pin and strain, and then the weird part, if that unit's order card is in reserve, you can spend an extra force to shuffle it into the controlling player's order deck. So I'll kind of look at this in two parts. One, a force to give something pin and strain. That can be very annoying for a character to deal with, because you can only heal one of them off. It could be the chance of like, well, okay, I heal the pin, and then the strain kills me, or I heal the strain and don't die, but then I can't go anywhere because I'm pinned. So it's quite a powerful combo, and there's situations where that will be very strong. So the second part, about putting the order card back into reserve, is, I'm going to keep using that word, it's weird. So that you're spending a force to do it, and your opponent will have spent a force to put them into reserve. So it's kind of force neutral, and you get to refresh force, so potentially that's good. But it has potential to be quite low impact, I think. So for example, if you put that card back into their deck, then they shuffle it in such a way that, it's going to be random, but if they shuffle it in such a way that they draw that card as they would have wanted to play it anyway, that ability does nothing. Sometimes you draw a character or a unit that you don't want to go with because, they've got a ton of conditions on them, they're on the wrong side of the board or something, they're just going to have a very low impact. And you put them into reserve because you just don't want to go with them. And if you shuffle that unit back into your opponent's deck, in a weird way, it frees up their reserve slot. So it might happen that they draw that card again immediately and have to pay another force to put it back in. But it might be that you put it on the bottom of the deck and they don't draw it, and in fact it just frees up their reserve slot and they have more options. So those are the negatives. I mean, there is also kind of a positive option where you can say, oh, if this character doesn't get on this objective, I win. Like if your opponent only has one character that can get an objective to stop you scoring and you win, you can just try and put that, if that character is in reserve, you can try and put it back into the deck so they don't draw it and can't get that effect, and you just win. So, there's good and bad, but I don't think it's massively powerful. I don't think this is why you're taking Hondo. The next one, this effort is no longer profitable. Another allied unit within 4 becomes wounded. This unit may use this reactive ability. Hondo gets to reposition, and he cannot end this movement engaged. So note he says engaged with anyone. So obviously it has to be an enemy, but it can be a wounded enemy. And that's going to be tricky, I think, a lot of the time. So definitely being able to react to an opponent doing something with a full reposition is very strong. But not being able to end the move engaged can be really limiting and can make it very tricky to use. So you're going to have to be very careful and probably do quite a bit of pre-measuring before you decide to use it or not, to see if you can fit Hondo into a point where he's going to be useful. And if you're playing against Hondo, there's probably quite easy ways to play around this. So for example, if you just stand your unit directly on top of an objective that Hondo might want to get onto using this ability, Hondo cannot contest that objective without also being engaged with the character on top of it, so he can't get it back. So you're never going to say no to extra movement abilities, but I'm not convinced it's the best, and you really want to think carefully before spending force on it. The next thing is fair what's fair, his identity. Basically, when an allied scoundrel makes an attack, if there is an ally engaged with the target, in melee with it, you can add 2 dice to the attack roll, but if it does, every allied unit within 2 at the end, after the attack is resolved, gains a strain. And that excludes the attacker. So for example, if you're in melee and there's another character in melee with you, you don't risk giving a strain to yourself. So extra dice, always good, but there is this kind of strain downside. But the interesting part about it is that it is after the attack is resolved. So, for example, if you get to shove the character you're attacking out of range of the ally within 2, that ally no longer gets a strain because it's no longer within 2. So you can play around it. And if we look at Hondo, and we'll see in other units later, that he has, at least on his Pugnacious Pirate side, a shove on the first result of his tree, so he can get that shove and try and reduce the negative impact of it. I think extra dice are always good. Vader has shown that. People love Vader. The negative part about it is it has to be a scoundrel, so it reduces your kind of flexibility in squad building. And the other thing is it obviously needs someone to be engaged with the defender, so it's going to be weak in the early game when you don't necessarily have people who are up and engaged. And if your opponent positions themselves cleverly to not be engaged with your units, you're not going to get the benefit of his identity. So it has a very high potential upside, I think, but it is going to be tricky to use, and it's going to be difficult to use against better players. A quick chat just about his stance cards. They're pretty good. He's got one that is, quite good defensively in terms of clever captain. One expertise for a crit to a fail is pretty good. And then Pugnacious Pirate, he has decent expertise. He's kind of a mid-range damage level at capping out about 8 for a primary. So you're not bringing him to kill a lot of stuff. He's just kind of here to do his tricks and to support his friends. Defensively, he's kind of weak at 9 stamina and only 5 dice, but I don't know. He's not terrible, I think. If you want to use him, it's not a reason you wouldn't use him, I think, potentially. Alright, we spent quite a lot of time on Hondo because he's quite complicated. So let's move on and try and speed through the other stuff a bit more. So, Gworm, the secondary. He's not unique, but he is special within Shatterpoint for being a 3-cost secondary. There's not very many of them in the game. So let's have a quick chat about him. First, his tactic is get moving, you dogs. Choose another Weak-uay within 4. That's another Weak-uay. Each character in the unit may dash. So if you're targeting Weak-uay pirates, who we'll talk about in a sec, they both get to move. Or Hondo gets to move. Currently in the game, that's the only people who get to do it. Or potentially units that have payday, like bounty hunters. Interestingly, he cannot move himself with this. So he has very limited movement options. All he can do is move and take cover for the purposes of trying to get somewhere. He can get a reposition right at the end of his tree, but that's not ideal. If he had something like a defensive maneuver or something that'll let him do a climb like Crosshair has, he'd be a lot better, but then he is only a 3. Spotchka rations. Choose a scoundrel within 3, they can heal twice. It's quite a situational thing of where you're going to want to spend a force on this or not. I think probably a lot of the time you will not end up using this unless it's to take off, say, a pin from your primary, or to take off a strain from a primary that would kill them if they went. Things like that, but probably say taking 2 damage off something you're probably not going to do because it's not going to make that much impact, but I suppose it's nice to have. Pack Hunter, if he makes a melee attack targeting an enemy character that is engaged with another Weak-uay, it adds 2 dice to the attack roll, so it brings his dice from quite a not very good 5 for a secondary to decent enough 7. But he has to be in melee, and he is a sniper character, which we'll get into in a bit, and he doesn't really want to be in melee, so I think that it doesn't really suit what he's trying to do. I've got you in my sights. It's very reminiscent of Cody and Gar Saxon, so he has Sharpshooter 2. Your enemy unit does not benefit from cover, and when he makes a focus action he gains a hunker. So he has a little bit of action economy, because he gets a focus and a hunker from one action, but I think he is quite awkward to use, and I have to say I'm not a big fan of him. So the thing I don't like is basically what his action pattern wants to be is he wants to take a focus action so he can benefit from his sharpshooter, and he wants to shoot. Those are going to be his 2 actions. So he just doesn't want to move at all. If you get to the end of his tree you get a reposition, but it's fingers crossed for that point. You need 5 results. It's not reliable. He's not reliable. He can't get onto an objective on the center line on turn 1 from deployment. He just doesn't have enough movement to do that. He needs something like Hondo to move him first. His dice are pretty pants. Like, if he doesn't get his focus action and he's not getting the benefit of Hondo's identity, he's not doing particularly well, I think. So I think ultimately he's not he's not very good. Like, he reminds me of Cody, and Cody never sees play. He reminds me a little bit of Pons, but I think Pons is better, and I'm not a big fan of Pons. So, I mean, he's got good expertise, so if he is getting his large amounts of dice, he can start shoving people a lot, but I'm not very excited to put Gorm in squads, I must say. Alright, moving on. Weak-uay Pirates. These are the guys at the support. Let's go through their abilities quickly. Raiding party, spend a force, and each character in the unit may climb. It's very similar to something like defensive maneuver, although they don't get the hunker, but it's a different type of movement. It's not a dash. So climbs are kind of good and bad. Obviously they let you gain height, but the big negative is you can't do it while you're in combat. You can't do it while you're engaged. So, you know, there will be situations where they just get bogged down in combat, and they'll be a bit sad. Moving on, greedy. When they're contesting an active objective, they gain steadfast. That's just really good. Nothing else to say about that. You don't want to get shoved. And then they've pack hunter, same as Guarm. Although it makes a bit more sense for them than Guarm, because they're just going to run together. So there's always going to be another allied Weak-uay character in the same combat, ideally. So their melee dice will go up to a decent enough 7 for a support character. If you pair that with Hondo, and again, there's always going to be an ally in the combat because your other Weak-uay pirate is going to be there. You're going to benefit from his identity. So you're getting up to 9 dice, which is quite high for a support. And their expertise is fine. You know, 2 hits on 2 expertise is fine. It kind of diminishes going up 3+, but that's what you'd expect. And you know, and they also have decent damage for supports, so they can get 6. And they have a shove on the first result in the tree, so they can, you know, not get the strain from Hondo by shoving stuff away. So I think that's where they're exciting, is kind of getting large numbers of dice and trying to kill stuff. You know, potentially you could put them with Vader and get them up to 12 dice as well, as with Hondo. But, I mean, that would be pretty scary to see them coming at you. And they're kind of a rare thing as they're a support that could potentially, you know, take a primary from full health to 0 health in one turn with the amount of dice they have. Defensively, they're pretty pants. 8 stamina's fine, but they've only got 4 defense dice. 3 expertise being a block and a climb seems pretty rubbish, because they're almost certainly going to die, and then that climb means, you know, if they're in something with melee is punching them, and they're still engaged at the end of the attack, they can't use that climb because they're engaged. So not very exciting defensively. They're pretty much a glass cannon, I think, but, you know, not bad, I'm going to say. Right, so moving on and thinking about who we might pair them with. We obviously want scoundrels to maximise what we're going to get from Hondo's identity. This is a list of all the scoundrels in the game. I've put the URL of where I've gotten this info from, Point Break SW, which is my particular favourite squad builder, if anyone is looking for a squad builder for Shatterpoint. So there is quite a few in the game, and there's only more coming out soon. But if we go to what we can put with Hondo, here's all the current supports and secondaries who are scoundrels. And then if we rule out what can't go with Hondo, we get left with this. So supports, we can't use IG-11 because he's too expensive. There's no 2-cost secondary that could fit in. Lando and R2-D2 are the wrong era. IG-11 is actually the wrong era as well, I suppose. So that means you're limited to a 4-cost support if you're trying to go full scoundrel. So the Weak-uay Pirates, Echo and Tech, or Bounty Hunters. And then if we look at secondaries who could go with a 4-cost support within the 7 squad points, most of them are too expensive, or yeah, I mean, they're just too expensive, or they're in the wrong era. So it would be Grief or Gorm, but Grief is the wrong era, so Gorm it is. And that's a bit unfortunate because, as we said, Gorm is not amazing. But it does leave us with this. I think if you take Gorm, you have to take the Weak-uay Pirates just to try and get the most out of Gorm. So there we go. Yeah, it's just a Hondo box if we're trying to go full scoundrel, I think. But then the question of who do we put them with? We usually choose primary first if we're looking at, you know, building a squad because they're the most impactful thing. But in this case, I think Django is just too good to ignore. He's just so bloody good. It's unreal. He's always been very strong, but I think Hondo has a chance to like push him up a level. So the reason why is Django has a kind of a point within his tree where he sometimes gets stuck, and you often really want to get over that point, and that's between 2 and 3 successes. So 2 successes does 3 damage on a strain. If you get an extra success, you get to do more damage in a jump, or you can do one of your active abilities for free. And Django, to be maximally impactful, Django really wants to get to 3 results most of the time. And Hondo's ability lets him do that, lets him get those extra dice. The other thing about Django is a lot of his damage, it's kind of spikes towards the end. If you see both of these end of his tree squares have got 3 damage on them. So if he starts getting there, he can start one-shotting characters. So Hondo really helps one of the best characters in the game mitigate one of his, I don't even want to call it a weakness, because his dice are fine, they're not amazing. But Hondo just makes every aspect of him amazing. So Django. We're going with Django. Django sets our era, so we have to go with something you can go in the kind of Clone Wars era. I've gone with the Bounty Hunters. I think there's very little difference between them and Echo and Tech. I think you could justify taking either of them. The reason I like the Bounty Hunters a bit more is their on the trail ability lets them dash without having to spend a force. I think that's going to be good towards the end of the game when you really don't want to be spending force. But I think you could justify either very easily. And then primary. So there's 2 primaries you can consider. The first being Lord Maul, the second being Cad Bane. So Maul has been very good since the game began. He's very fast, he's got diceless displacement, he's very low force cost because he can take damage instead of spending force, and he also has his revenge ability, which can stop your opponent taking points off him. He's just very good. There's no question about that. Cad, he's also very good. I think he is much harder to use, and he's much more difficult to get the full effect out of. And if you leave him out of position, he can just spend the whole game kind of hopping around and not really doing anything. That's not a reason not to bring him necessarily. If you think you can do it, you should back yourself and just try and get the most out of him. He's got decent damage, but not as much as Maul. He's quite frail in a similar way to Hondo, so you're kind of doubling up on that weakness. And he's also a force refresh character, which is nice because you're refreshing a lot of force, but it means you've got 4 force points at the start of the game, and that's your cap. So you're going to have to start refreshing force pretty quickly or you're going to run out. So for my money, I think I prefer Maul. I think I really like diceless displacement. I think it's one of the best things in the game. I think the fact that he doesn't really spend much force really goes well with Hondo, because Hondo, he's got a lot of abilities that cost force, so he's quite force expensive even with his refresh. So I like him a lot, and I think he's just strong. But again, I think you could probably justify going either way on this, especially for theme. You just want to go with Cad. So here we go. Here's our full Scoundrels list, and I think it's pretty good. The things that I don't love about it are, it seems quite fragile. Guarm I don't think is up to snuff. He's going to lower the capability of the whole squad, because I'm not going to call him a dead activation, but he's not going to get what you need him to do most of the time, I think. But otherwise it's good, and it looks like it'll be very fun. So there's our maximum Scoundrels option. If you moved on to what alternative builds could be, this is kind of a Galactic Republic version. So we talked about Bad Batch in the last video and how they're all Scoundrels. So we could build it like this, where we have the kind of 3 best Bad Batch units in one squad, and then in the other we have Hondo, Django, who you're not going to leave him behind, he's too good, and then from the right era we can put in the ARFs. So the ARFs, they don't support Hondo or Django, but they do give coordinated fire expose for the Bad Batch. They'll benefit from Hunter's leadership. It seems quite good. I think this is perhaps a stronger option than the previous one, but also looks quite fun, I think. And then the last one I'm going to talk about as an option is much more of a mishmash. So same Hondo squad as the previous version, but now we've got Darth Vader. Darth Vader's very good. You're going to get really insane dice totals and you can just absolutely melt face. The ARFs are only providing support to Vader. He's the only Galactic Republic unit, but there have been squads built like that before that have had success. You know, Vader's just good enough that you can bring the ARFs along with him and they just mince their way through stuff together. But the thing I find really interesting and want to talk about most in this squad is the combo with Greef Karga and Jango Fett. So Greef has got Close the Deal. So when an enemy chooses to activate a unit from reserve, you can use Close the Deal. You choose a bounty hunter, of which Jango is one, and this character can immediately dash and make a 5 dice attack. So this is really, I think, very strong always, as long as you've got a bounty hunter, but it's especially good in combination with Not So Fast, which I'm sure everybody knows about, but it's basically Jango's ability where when a unit activates, as long as it's within 3 of him, he rolls 5 dice. For every hit and crit, you do a damage. And if you kill that unit with that ability, their turn just ends. So you're essentially taking a full turn away from your opponent. It's extremely strong. And it's the kind of thing that can just, you know, win a game on its own. It'd be a complete pivot point that can turn everything on its head if you're losing, or you can just be absolutely crushing if you're already ahead. So why it's so good with Close the Deal is, one, it lets Jango move around, so he can move to be within range 3 of the unit that's activating, so he can Not So Fast, and also he lets him do some more damage before he does Not So Fast. So now the average on these things is, it's probably end up something like, I've not done the math, but it's probably something like 5 or 6 damage is the average you're going to do. So if something is, you know, taking just a little bit of tickle damage, it's 5 or 6 health, and it's in reserve, it's suddenly very risky to try and go. One thing about Close the Deal is it's when the opposing player chooses to act a unit from reserve. So it's before the character actually activates. So if you kill a unit with Close the Deal, they don't lose their activation like they do with Not So Fast. So it's a bit less impactful if you do it that way. You know, you can always stop as you're going along your tree. So for example, if you're about to kill something with your 5 dice attack, like they whiffed and you spiked, you can stop, and then as they go, you just Not So Fast them and kill them. It's quite force heavy, but if you manage to get the combo off, you'll refresh force with Jango anyway. And it's just potentially very powerful. It's very scary. I think you're probably going to see it quite a lot. People are going to try this thing out. Yeah, but there we are. So thanks for watching. I think all those options seems quite fun. I think, you know, limited power perhaps is, I don't think any of them are going to be top tier, but you can definitely win games. And you know, if you put on your thinking cap, I think you can get a lot out of Hondo. And I have to say, I've kind of changed my tune on him a bit. I do think when I first saw him, I thought he was pants, but now I think, you know, I'll try and get him on the table, see what he can do. I think he'll be, at the very least, very fun. So thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Please let me know if you think any differently to what I've said. I think it is complicated, and if you think what I've said is total nonsense and that you know better, you're probably right. Just let me know. I like to think about these things. I like to talk about these things. So yeah, see ya.